Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for Capturing the Upside and Buffering the Downside, a Center for Commercial Agriculture webinar here at Purdue University. Here November 30th, just after the Thanksgiving Day holiday. And so in the spirit of Thanksgiving, certainly appreciate our agricultural producers that helped feed a hungry nation this past holiday season, and looking forward to another successful year. So you probably don't recognize me, you recognize the gentlemen that are with me, but I'm substituting for Jim Minter today. Our center director is traveling, and as a result of that, you might be used to emailing him your questions during the webinar, but instead today, please send those to my email address, and we'll be sure to get your questions answered as we go. So as I mentioned, two familiar faces with me today, Dr. Mike Bulge, our Distinguished Professor of Agricultural Economics at Purdue, and Dr. Michael Langemeyer, Professor at Purdue and Associate Director for the Center for Commercial Agriculture. So thanks for being with us today, guys.
You bet. You bet.
So what we want to think about is some of the things that are happening in the industry, and maybe how we do strategy for the long term in terms of the upcoming crop years. And one of the things that's coming out and we're starting to understand is the picture unfolding around net farm income. And so this is still a forecast from the United States Department of Agriculture, but it looks like net farm incomes are going to continue their slide from their peaks back in 2013 and be right around about $60 billion of farm income in 2015. And unless you expect rise in corn or soybean prices, I suspect that picture is going to continue to be either in that direction or maybe start to level off somewhere.
And Mike, that's really a pretty precipitous decline. That's about a 50% decline from 2 years ago. And so that's obviously makes one start thinking about what to do in this kind of a business climate and how to manage your business in this kind of situation. And so one of the first things that this slide really kind of identifies is probably the first thing to be worried about in terms of financial vulnerability, and that is this issue of the working capital position that farm operators have. And so it's really, really going to be important for farmers to really look at their working capital position. We calculate working capital as current assets minus current liabilities, and so you're the finance guy. What are these? What are these current assets? What are they?
Yeah, that's right. So on our farming operations, probably mostly inventories, right? So we're going to have a stock of inventories that we can use, and on the current liabilities side, we might have some short-term borrowings or some accounts payable from our suppliers.
Yep, and we also want to make sure on those current liabilities we put in this year's payment on that capital expenditure debt, so on the machinery and the equipment as well as the land, et cetera. So we want to calculate that. We use that rather than the current ratio. That's a much more meaningful way, we think, to look at this question of what kind of buffer we have against this financial stress. We really would like to have about 30% of gross revenue. Some people calculate it as total expenses. Either right now, expenses and revenue are close enough that it doesn't make much difference which one you use there for the denominator, right? So about a 30% of gross revenue. Now, normally what we'd like is about, we usually think, Michael, about a buffer here of about 20%, but we're kind of suggesting we need to have a little bit better buffer in these times than we have right now, right? And the issue is because we do worry about this thing we call the burn rate. And the burn rate basically is how much of that working capital is probably going to get absorbed because of operating losses. And I think, Michael, you just did some number crunching on this, and we've got $100 per acre operating loss for 2016, but I think you told us just before, you brought some numbers over and said maybe it's even going to be a little bit more than that, right?
Yes, it could easily be $125 to $135 just for 2016. And then you got to add to that what could happen in 2017 and 2018. They're probably not going to be on positive. They're probably still going to be burning working capital in 17 in particular, but probably 2018 too. And so that's why we're suggesting this 30%. Because once you drop below that, Mike, it's really hard to get that back up, and when the cash flow is tight.
So this issue of working capital is really important, but there's other ways that we need to kind of worry about the vulnerability as well. And I think this tight repayment capacity, Michael, isn't that something also we need to be concerned about?
Yeah, certainly. Anytime you have a working capital concerns, you're also going to have repayment capacity, concerns. And so one of the things that we've been talking about at previous webinars that's extremely important is let's make sure that our equipment and land loans are stretched out, and we're not trying to pay off these things in 3 years or 5 years. Let's stretch those out a little bit to kind of match the length of the assets if at all possible. And so if you haven't done that, certainly take a look at that, because certainly when you look at the tight cash flows, there's not going to be a lot of money in some cases to pay back the principal and interest, yet alone save some money to buy new assets.
Yep, yep. And in fact, we've got some calculations that you picked up here that are kind of worthwhile for us to take a look at, Michael. Mike, so let's take a look at them.
Right, so here we've got a trend over time of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's analysis of loan repayment capacity of farm operations, and you can see here in the year 2015 we're about as low as we've been since 1998, and so that might be a bit of a concern for producers as they make decisions for next crop year. So down at a low since 1998, but we were joking this morning, not, well, it's no joke really, but not as bad as it was in the 1980s. And so the joke was about who was alive and understood and fully appreciated what was going on there. And Michael, maybe you've got some perspective of just how rough that was. And
well, Mike's older than me, so he remembers that better than I do. But certainly that mid-1980s was a very tough time for loan repayment, and it was difficult to make payments on principal and interest, yet alone buy assets. Right. And so it's a worse situation than we're in now, but quite frankly, I hate to be too bearish here, but quite frankly, if prices remain relatively low here, 16, 17 are going to be rough.
Yeah, it's not going to be pleasant, but we're still thinking, Michael, I think that we're going to be able to come out of this with what we kind of refer to as a soft landing, rather than the bust or the crash that we saw in the 1980s.
Yes, because definitely in the mid-1980s, we saw asset values decline 50%, Mike, and our projections are still 25, 30%. With low prices, and they might not be that high.
You're more pessimistic than I am, but
depending on what prices are, they might not drop that much.
That's right. That's
that
right.
much,
so would you put, if you were looking out into 2016, 2017, 2018, would you put that red box over there into the future, or are you looking more at a 1998 kind of maybe more rapid recovery?
My judgment is that I don't know that I'm going to put us in as much of a downside as we saw in the 80s. I do worry about, though, whether we're going to get that really nice rapid recovery you saw right after 1988. I think we're going to kind of slide along the bottom here for a little while. So,
and you look at that chart, it was going from about 40 to 80 there in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I don't expect that big a bump going into 16, 17. It's going to stay relatively low for a while here.
But then there is this issue of the solvency position. That's what a lot of people talk about, Mike. So what's that looking like for us?
Well, as an industry, clearly we're still much below where we were in the 1980s in terms of leverage, and so producers have built up their equity positions, and part of that is probably due to increasing land values, and so that's helped strengthen the balance sheet. But we want to pay attention as those come back down and we burn through some of this cash, what that means for equity position. And so the good thing is producers maybe haven't leveraged up as much as they did in the 80s, and we've seen few defaults, and I think you had some perspective on maybe what the potential for defaults are given.
Yeah, right now, I mean, Alan Featherstone at Kansas State University has done a recent study with Kansas data in the plains, but nevertheless, it should be similar to the Corn Belt, and the probability of default right now, based on his work, is fairly low. You can get comparable to 1979, but the key thing here is we're still looking at some pretty strong equity positions in those calculations that he was doing. If we have some weakening of land values, particularly if it's 25, 30%, and some weakening of machinery values, you could take some equity out pretty fast, and that's going to be very negative on solvency. It's not going to be a train wreck for a lot of people, but nevertheless, it's not going to look as good as it does right now.
So I think that maybe the focus we ought to have is, okay, so everybody's kind of feeling that things aren't good.
Yes.
So what do we do about it? How do we respond in this situation? What's the ways that we can kind of respond to this and figure out how to do a better job of positioning ourselves to be able to handle this downside? So maybe we ought to move into that, and I suspect let's just start at a fairly high level. And I think really the number one issue to think about is we're going to have to kind of return to some of the stuff that were doing prior to this run-up that we had for the last 4 or 5 years, and that is that we just got to be best in class. Now, the first question you have, what class you in? I mean, it's kind of like you showing cattle or showing pigs in a state fair. You got to make sure you know what class you're in. We're going to really focus here on the class mean we just got to be a low-cost producer. Certainly, if you're in other industries, there may be different ways that you respond to the downturn, but in much of the commodity industry of corn, beans, wheat, cotton, et cetera, we just got to really be low cost, and that's really, really, really an essential part of being successful in this business climate. We're going to come back to that at the end because that also allows us to have the agility to kind of respond to this because there is some upside of this downturn as well. So probably the first thing to do is to think about how to be best in class, and if you're focused on cost, we got to worry about what we're going to do to be able to lower those costs. And one way to do that, Mike, is to just kind of figure out what you're really, really good at and do that better than anybody else, right?
That's right. So related to a fable, would you rather be a fox or a hedgehog? Here we're thinking about wanting to be a hedgehog because they do one thing really well, better than anybody else, and it allows them to sustain in the long run. So a fox is sly and he has a lot of different approaches to it, but maybe isn't well positioned to make it in the long run. And so here we've got the hedgehog concept that says you've got to focus in on the 2 or 3 things that you can do better than anybody else. Do it as well as you possibly can so that you can outcompete and make it in the long run. And so it might be an opportunity to refocus on the things that we're passionate about, that we care about, that we're good at, and make sure that we're doing those things as well as we possibly can. And in order to be sure that we're doing those as well as we can, we've got to track and measure and monitor, and that relates to cost control. And I think, Dr. Bulger, you're going to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think maybe Michael's probably got more insight to this than I. One of the problems we got here when we got 3 mics, you know, kind of
which mic was it
which
supposed
mic
to
do
be?
we want to work on,
That's
right? Michael, what about
talk
these
a little
cost
bit about
control?
doing fewer things better. What I typically do with producers is a thought process is thinking about what are my unique resources in terms of human capital. What am I really, really good at? What are and focus on those. Make sure that you're taking advantage of those strengths. If your strength is managing grain storage, you know, make sure you spend a lot of time on that and really try to improve costs, improve your margin with that grain storage. And so really, really carefully think about that. If you haven't went through an exercise like that before, please do that before after this webinar is really do some soul searching and think about what do I do better than everybody else, and how can I take advantage of that skill so I can lower costs, improve margins in this tight environment.
And Michael, you said something really interesting there. You didn't say, okay, it's about growing corn. It's the activities that are involved in growing corn or growing beans that we're really interested in.
Managing the fertilization aspect, managing the seed cost, storage it was an example I used earlier. Managing machinery, investment. There's probably several of those things a producer might be good at, but certainly take advantage of those. And you probably have different family members that wear different hats and have different strengths. So take advantage of those strengths of the different family members. It's something you certainly want to do in this environment. Mike said earlier, one of the common strategies is to be a low-cost producer. We've pursued that for a long time in production agriculture. What does that mean? It means being as productive as you possibly can be given the resources you have. And so we're not looking at cutting costs here that are necessarily going to cut yields. That may or may not be the right thing to do. And so that's very important for us to think about that. That's why I say productivity. What's our output relative to the inputs that we're putting into production? That's what productivity how productivity is defined by economists. And so let's think of it that way. Every change we make in our operation, regardless of the cost category, let's think about what's the benefits of making that change and what is the cost. The cost might be giving up yield. If you're giving up too much yield, do you really have any advantage there? And so we encourage people to look at cost both per acre and probably more importantly per bushel.
Okay, now let's talk about that a second, because most of the stuff that we've done in our budgeting work has been on a per acre basis, but you're saying here per unit sold, per bushel.
Yes.
Let's look. Why would we want to do that per bushel?
Because that gets at very quickly this idea that if I'm changing my fertilization program, what's going to be how does that impact my bushels? And so we're right away recognizing that fact. that if we're making a change in a particular cost item, we're recognizing the impact on the yield.
Okay, and it also maybe helps us think a little bit about if we want to later on talk about doing a better job marketing, we kind of know what our cost is per bushel of whatever we're going to be selling, right? And so it helps us think about whether we got a positive margin or not in that analysis.
And I know some people don't have the cost per acre, cost per bushel for their farm, yet alone by field. But I think in this environment, I think we need to go by field.
Okay.
And that's gonna tie into our next webinar, which I'll advertise and market at the end. But you know, if you're going to look at cash rent decisions, let's just get after it a little bit. If you're going to look at cash rent decisions, each field, each tract is different. Each landlord tract is different, and so you need to know your cost at least by landlord, and so you can come into those negotiations knowing how productive that ground is, and knowing what your costs are, and use that to negotiate the cash rent.
Right.
So sometimes, Mike, when I have these conversations about knowing your cost per bushel, producers say, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what my output's going to be next year. I don't know what my yield's going to be next year. How can I do that?
I would use a 5-year average yield, for example. I mean, our budget's what we have is low, average, and high productivity. And so based on your ground, you know whether that ground is capable of being 180 bushel corn or 200 bushel corn. So use that. You know, as your basis for your 2016 budget.
Yeah, and so my response to that question is saying, okay, that kind of assumes that you put fertilizer out there without having any idea of what the yield potential is on that fertilizer. You fertilize for a particular level of yield, right? And
same the seeding rate.
Yeah, seeding rate.
Using
right. And the other thing, I mean, so if you've bought crop insurance, you've got history there, so you can use that crop insurance information in terms of what your yield potential is. So will you be able to hit it exactly on in terms of what will really happen? No, but when people in any other business do projections, they have to say, here's how much we expect to sell, here's how many cars we're going to sell, here are my tractors, whatever it might be. Everybody has to do a little projection on sales, right? And that's what you ought to do as a farmer as well, to get some idea of what kind of cost you're going to have per bushel of whatever you're going to sell, or per unit of whatever you're going to sell.
Another obvious point is we're not selling corn on per acre.
Yeah.
You know, I don't go to the elevator and say, I got so much corn per acre. What can you give me for it? We sell it per bushel.
Yeah.
And so we want to match that corn price and soybean price to our per unit cost. And that leads us right into this slide is very similar, only now we're putting the revenue along with the costs and calculating the contribution margin, the revenue over operating or variable costs, your seed, your fertilizer, your repairs, your fuel, interest on operating costs, crop insurance. Those would be your typical variable costs. You want to make sure that that's positive, of course, but that needs to be big enough to at least cover some of the overhead costs. And the big overhead cost items are machinery ownership, which is larger than it was 10 years ago.
That's right.
We've got more money out there in machinery investment, and so that's a larger cost than it was 10 years ago. Labor, we've got to make sure that we can cover hired labor, but also something for our time, or the opportunity cost for family labor, and then cash rent or opportunity costs on owned ground. Those would be your big overhead costs. And the next 2-3 years, revenue above all costs is going to be negative. That's the way it looks. I mean, it thinks something could happen. Corn soybean price could spike up here, but we don't expect that necessarily to happen. So using the information we currently have, that looks like that's going to be negative. And so this last point is going to be rather challenging, Mike, trying to predict positive margins. In some cases, we might be trying to predict a relatively small negative margin.
Yeah. Okay, and that's a really important kind of point to recognize. So maybe two things here. One is, it used to be, okay, if we could protect 50-cent profit, or gee, do we hold out for 60 cents, 70 cents, or maybe $1, right? A bushel, right? No, if we've got a nickel, we better lock it in, right? A nickel is worthwhile locking in this kind of business climate. But you're even maybe implying here that maybe I need to lock in a loss. If I think about covering full costs here, fully loaded costs, I might need to price before I ever get to that positive profit margin.
I think that's something that needs to be considered.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's definitely something that needs to be considered, because you have some you have to cover some of these overhead costs, and so that would ensure that you at least covered some of the overhead costs.
Right. Okay. Okay.
And maybe had a low return for your labor and a low return for the ground that you own,
Yeah.
but try to cover some of these other costs that are actual costs rather than opportunity costs.
You know, it's really tough. It really is tough to lock in losses. I mean,
Oh, it's really tough.
That is tough stuff.
Yeah.
But the really important thing is if you think that there's a pretty decent chance that the market is not going to show enough improvement to lock in, what you don't want to do is to run away from you on the downside even further,
Yeah.
and find out that your losses are bigger than you. So at least you've got some. This is kind of what we call minimize the cost strategy,
Yeah.
minimize the loss strategy, rather than maximize the profit strategy.
And
And we may have to do that.
And let's go back to the mid-1980s where we saw quite a few losses. You get into that mind frame. Well, I have their losses. There's no use doing a lot of marketing here because they have losses.
Yeah.
And then you have to market a few months down the road because of cash flow needs, and you might not market at the right time.
That's right. That's right.
And so you have to really be cognizant of that. I mean, because you're going to have to market
Right.
relatively more of the grain rather than store it
Right.
in the next year or two compared to where we've been in the last 5 years. And so you have to worry about that.
Right.
Holding it and then selling it at just the wrong time.
Yeah.
Because guess what? At that wrong time is when a lot of other people may be also
That's
selling,
right.
and so
That's
they
right. That's right. Exactly. So the other part of this is what some people call execution, or just doing everything right. Okay, and here's kind of the storyline that we're kind of trying to help people understand. A lot of people think that the way to kind of get themselves back into a better profit margin is to do a better job of marketing. Is to do a better job. I hear that all the time in the countryside. Now, does that mean, do we not think that there might not be some opportunities to price? I mean, we had some run up in prices here in the last 3 or 4 months that had a chance to take advantage. Didn't ever get above cost of production, but at least we got better prices, and then it fell back down. In fact, your budgets are showing that we've had even some softness even the last couple of months in terms of prices,
Yes.
and losses have increased even more.
particularly corn.
Particularly on corn, right? So sometimes what I tell farmers is, I don't have a lot of control over what the price of my corn's going to be, or the price of my soybeans. I do have a lot of control over what yields I get and how good I am in terms of getting those yields, in terms of getting the efficiency, productivity, et cetera. And so that's what I've got control over. And so in terms of execution, I have to really, really focus on just everything I do, just doing it right. One way to do this is to use something that we frequently call standard operating procedures. Now, a lot of farmers will say, well, gee, I can't use standard operating procedures. You want me to identify the specific steps I need to go through to do whatever job it is. It could rain and can't do in that sequence. And that's true. But what that means is that you probably ought to have, before you go to the field, you ought to already have identified what plan B is, right? So what you do is you do set up a set of standard operating procedures for each kind of task or each type of activity. And notice we're talking about activities here. When you are producing any crop, you've got a set of activities, and what you need to do is think about those activities, what the sequence is to do those activities, and we'll talk about that in terms of some scheduling things here in a little bit. But you really do need to identify those standard operating procedures to get this done in a timely and a reasonable fashion. And it's particularly true if you've got a workforce that you're trying to make sure they get it done in the right way, in the right fashion, et cetera. Now, some farmers say, well, I don't have a workforce out there. I'm doing it all myself. Doggone, we forget. Gee whiz, things just don't quite, I forgot to do it that way. Forgot to do it in that sequence, and boy, that could be a real problem for us.
But Dr. Langemeyer started off saying that we're only supposed to do the things that we're passionate about. I'm not passionate about this paperwork that you're talking about.
I know. I agree with you, but by gosh.
Is it really worth my time to write all this
It
stuff
is worth
down?
your time, and by gosh, if you don't want to do it, then you need to get somebody else to give you that list of things to do. I mean, I always use the analogy in terms of if you ever fly and you get on the airplane, you look out there and there's this guy floating around down and looking around the ground, And what's he doing? He's ground checking, right? He's the pilot out there. I mean, he isn't, somebody that just kind of floated. He's the pilot, got off that plane, does all the ground checks. Then when he gets in the cockpit, he does a whole bunch of checklists and that type of thing. He just landed this plane 15 minutes ago, right? I mean, it ought to be working all right, right? No, he goes out and checks it again. He just took off a half hour ago in this plane. He went through that checklist one. He says, I don't know, maybe I need to do, he does it again, he does it again. They do 6 or 7 checklists a day in terms of the same thing, making darn sure they've got the sequence, and you might say, well, he's worried a little bit about safety. I understand that safety's maybe a little bit higher criteria to worry about, but we're worried about the financial safety of this business now, right? And so what we really do need to do is to just make sure that we've got things done in terms of accurately and do it in a very, very explicit fashion.
And probably what's going to happen here in the next 2 or 3 years is our machinery set's going to start getting older. We've bought a lot of machinery since 2007. Farms in general have spent quite a bit of money on machinery since the ethanol boom started in 2007. And so next 2 or 3 years, you're probably not going to be buying as much machinery. The machinery is going to get a little older.
Right.
We need to make sure that we have that stuff repaired and ready to go. And so it's going to be a little more challenging than it has been a year or two ago.
Yeah. And in that sense, that context, farmers always do think about, particularly if they don't have a lot of livestock, about the winter period of time doing the work to get their machinery set up and make sure they got it all in the best condition, et cetera. But boy, if it's ever a year to spend more doing that than you ever have, it's got to be a year like this, right? To make sure that you really, really have got everything done, that you're really, really in well shape. So when that opportunity to go out and plant is there, that you don't have to say, whoops, forgot to get this done, forgot to get that done. We're going to have to really, really get prepared.
Yeah. So, another opportunity here in terms of being best in class is thinking about how we work with our suppliers on achieving the goals that we're interested in our business, in our hedgehog that we're pursuing. So one of the things that you might want to think about is using a specification sheet to collect a lot of information about the inputs you're trying to acquire. So we've got a specification sheet out on the Center for Commercial Agriculture website that you can use, and I've got some examples here in the slides, and we'll share the slides from the webinar out onto the website, so you'll be able to take a look at the pieces of information we suggest you consider collecting, but you also could add your own things. And so it helps to set your cost structure. So we heard Dr. Langemeyer talk about know your cost well, intensely manage those costs, and then lock in some margins that allow you to cover your variable and some part of your fixed costs, or ideally all of your fixed costs, right? So this relationship with your suppliers really sets your cost structure. And then it also gives you an opportunity to compare suppliers across the different metrics that are meaningful to you. So how well do they help with yields? How well do they help with your timeliness? How well do they come to the table with a competitive price? All these things are factors that you're considering as you think about, and the procurement, the specification sheet can help you think about that as you go about it. So another thing that we've been thinking about is controlling assets. So I can still remember my grandfather telling me that they're not making any more farmland, and so got to get out there and bid up the cash rents or bid up the prices we're paying for land, but just might want to be more careful in this environment about paying premiums to be able to farm that. And it might be time to pass on some fields or two if we think that the premium is too much. So
Pardon me, I'm sorry, but let me just kind of indicate there's going to be a lot of churn in this cash rental market, we think, this year, because there's going to be a lot of times when that cash rent is just too high for the current operator to continue on, and so he's going to give it up. But then the other question: nobody wants to give up rented land. I mean, things are going to turn around. We've got to make sure we have the opportunity to, when they turn around, that we've got it, rather than have to bid it away from whoever we gave it up to. So, Michael, we've got some things we can help them in terms of analyzing those types of things.
Yeah, and the December 18th webinar is going to focus on that. But really, what you're looking at in terms of premium here is we're talking about how much do you have to pay over break-even cash rent. When you do a budget, you can calculate what the break-even cash rent is. Quite frankly, in the next year or two, we're going to have to pay a pretty hefty premium over the market cash rent. But should that premium be $50? $100, $150. It will be in some cases $150.
Yeah.
When is it too much?
Yeah.
Well, that's not a one-year decision. So what we're encouraging people to look at is look at where their working capital is, and then kind of look at some scenarios. Look at some scenarios with respect to cash rental rates, and see how much premium they could afford to pay in 16 and 17 and still be okay from a working capital standpoint. And the neat thing about this, or the obvious thing about this, maybe that's not neat, but the obvious thing about this is everybody's premium is going to be different because everybody's starting with a different working capital position. Some people are starting with extremely strong working capital position. They can pay a higher premium if they choose to. I'm not saying they should, but if they choose to, that's a decision.
Not only pay a higher premium, but they actually have more capacity to pay it for a longer period of time and hold on to it. The worst thing is to pay a premium for 2 years, burn your working capital up, have to walk away from it, and then find out the price recovers, and you wish you had it, right?
Yeah. And that or look at the market cash rent and say the market cash rent is $50 under current cash rent, therefore I should give up that land. Not necessarily. You got to remember this premium may be a relatively short-term event. It may be 16, 17, and maybe a little bit of 18. And if you have the working capital, in some cases you can pay a premium of $50 or more.
Right. And then we also need to worry about, Michael, this whole issue of whether we ought to be buying some of that pretty attractively priced, almost new equipment, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's going to be some good deals out there. Or there are good deals out there in terms of pre-owned equipment that's fully under warranty, and I can buy it for 30% lower than the it's got 100 hours on the rotors on the combine. I mean, these are very, very seductive deals, right? And it's just going to be hard to walk away from that. But if I burn up my working capital doing that, I maybe got a new combine, but I don't have the ability to continue to farm it.
Very good point, yes.
Yeah, so
that's why we're saying be very cautious of that working capital, particularly with buying machinery. We're going to return to this on another slide here, but you can't emphasize it enough probably. Be particularly careful using your working capital to buy machinery, because then you're not going to be in a position to hold on to some of that cash rented ground.
Right.
You might not be able to do both. A lot of people can't do both.
Right. So Mike, let's take a look at this. We got a second here. Let's take a look at this specification sheet, and you can kind of see the types of things that we think are worthwhile to have a conversation with your supplier on. And I want to really make a really critical point here. I mean, we ought to be careful to not overpay for anything, right? I mean, we ought to be negotiating the best price we can for anything. But
Sometimes
price,
you get what you pay for.
That's exactly right, exactly. And so it's not all about price. And that's why you'll see on this this specification sheet we've got, I think actually if you go to the next slide, we've got 12 things on this specification sheet. And this is a way to have an informed conversation with your supplier about what you really want and what you really value and what he then can provide to you. And this then does allow you to make comparisons, not just price comparisons across different suppliers. Now, I think there's going to be some tough negotiations right now in terms of things like seed and particularly probably seed prices seem to be pretty lethargic, Michael, in terms of declining. We don't see a lot of softness in the seed, but what I keep hearing is that farmers are saying, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll just buy fewer traits in that seed. I'm not going to buy the triple stack type of stuff, or it's 5 or 6 stacked almost these days, right? That maybe what I'll do is I'll buy a good genetics, but rather than buy all of the pesticide and all of those controls in the seed, I'll kind of buy something with a few or less traits, and then I'm going to go out there and scout, do a lot of good scouting, and if I need to then do some control for an insect or a pest or something like that, I'll do that at that point. Critical thing, though, is if you use that strategy, make sure you know what plan B is going to be. You don't just do that and say, okay, now I don't know what to do if in fact I see that bug out there. You really better have a good plan B in place, because it could be that you are going to need to put some application of insecticides, herbicides on at a later stage.
Well, and another strategy there, Mike, is most farmers buy multiple hybrids. If it's corn or soybeans, they're buying multiple hybrids. But today, you might want to look at different characteristics of the hybrids even. as kind of a risk management strategy.
Right.
You know, buying quite a few hybrids that have different characteristics and to kind of control some of that downside risk.
Right. Kind of the same thing we use in the financial markets,
Yes.
right? Diversification has some benefits in this kind of environment. So another part of this best-in-class kind of strategy is to really work hard on this logistics issue. And when we're talking about logistics, we're really talking about this whole thing of doing a lot of, again, this doggone thing that Mike Gunderson says he doesn't like to do, and that's the paperwork side of the business, right? But actually putting together some schedules in terms of, you know, if we've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different fields that we're trying to do, let's make sure that we've got the right sequencing, and it becomes particularly important when we've got these fields quite a distance apart to make sure we got the right logical flow. We've got not only the machinery scheduled to be at the right field at the right time, but we got that input, making sure that, oh, we wanted to plant that, but we didn't get the fertilizer on in timely fashion. We got to get that kind of.
Here's an opportunity for working with the input supplier to think about what they can do to deliver a product when you need it, where you need it.
Absolutely, exactly. We have to worry about the other side of that in terms of making sure that we get that grain out into the storage and we don't sit in that long line at even our own dump sites, right? I mean, you know, a lot of farmers complain taking it to the elevator that got the long lines. Well, increasingly the way we're getting the capacity with our grain carts and our combines, we may have to have 2 or 3 dump sites in our own facility, right? In our operations, we got 4 dump sites because we were having lines at our own storage facilities, right? And so we need to really work hard at doing I've got a friend in the business who said, you know, a whole lot of my job now to run this business is managing the logistics, making sure I got not just the right machinery, but the right people with the right skill set, the right input suppliers, everything's set up so that in fact when it's ready to go, I'm ready to when I'm ready to go, it's all ready for me to go, right? And that isn't unrelated to this last point, 24/7 operations. I mean, if it's possible, and I know weather sometimes can interfere with this, but you know, we're into, in agriculture, I think something that I sometimes refer to as biological manufacturing. And most of these plants that we see out there, whether they be in the fertilizer or the chemical business, or whether you see in terms of livestock facilities, you know, they double shift them, triple shift them, sometimes they run 24/7. Boy, if we invest $500,000 in a combine, we can't have it sitting around there very many hours of the day. It just doesn't generate any revenue. This is what I guess finance guys call this asset turnover, right? Asset turnover.
Turns.
So turns. And now, does it mean, so Michael, I'm going to ask you to start working 24-hour days, right? No. Well, what we have to do is we have to figure out how to get our workforce put together so that we actually can double shift or triple shift or whatever we need to do so that we can actually get this done. Running that equipment more hours per day is really, really, really critical. Maybe you can't do it 24. Maybe you don't want to work Sunday or whatever the 7th day is. That's fine. But at least you got to really, really think seriously about what that does if you can't keep that machinery and equipment running through the field. I've got a friend in the potato business, and his goal is to run in the harvest and the planting season, to run his equipment 22 hours a day. 2 hours a day for road time and for maintenance. So he wants it in the field, generating revenue streams 22 hours a day. That's, I think, and he says, I hit it almost every year. I'm able to hit it. So we've got to just work hard at this whole issue of getting it done in a really, really, really timely fashion.
And this is my opportunity to encourage people to calculate the asset turnover ratio. If you have an income statement and a balance sheet, it's really easy to calculate. You take gross revenue or value of farm production, divide by your average total assets, and you wouldn't believe how variable that is across farms. And if you really want to get after how effectively utilizing your machinery in particular and your land, calculate that ratio.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I think So we've got some things around logistics that are important, working around our suppliers, but then there's also some risk ongoing that we need to
Yes.
think about.
Yes, and you can't ignore the typical risks that you're going to face, and we talked about this with seed selection. Relationship pest control. I mean, obviously those fit together, and so we have to think about selecting seed and fertilizer strategies that we're not going to give up too much yield in the strategies that we pick. But it's just a way of mitigating risk. I mean, I gave the example earlier of planting multiple hybrids with different characteristics. It's just a way to mitigate some risk there related to the production side. Obviously, marketing and pricing of inputs and products, we've talked about that already. I want to talk a little bit about that third bullet, government program and crop insurance participation. Mike and I have done some work recently, and the safety net is not as solid as it has been.
Got a lot of holes
in a few years ago, and in particular, what's happening here is we're looking at some fairly healthy Ark County payments for 14 and 15, but then as you get into 17 and 18, towards the end of the Farm Bill, those are going to go away. And then crop insurance is the revenue guarantee is so much lower than it was in 2012. In 2012, for West Central Indiana, for example, the revenue guarantee was over $1,000 per acre. Now we've taken $350, $400 off of that revenue guarantee, and so even though it's a very good safety net, I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy crop insurance. It's still a very good tool to use to mitigate downside risk, but it's not as good as it was 3 years ago. That's the point I'm making, and so the government program of crop insurance is not going to provide the total safety net. We're going to have to do some of these other strategies that we're talking about to help mitigate what I call downside risk, or try to chop off some of those lower net revenue.
Yeah, and Michael, on that, just I think back to the net income slide that we started with. I think my recollection is 20% of that net income in 2015 is projected to come from either crop insurance indemnities or from the Ark County or from government. So 20% of it. And so it's not insignificant for the 2015 year, but the concern that we're worried about is that it's probably not going to be nearly as good. And in fact, back to the Ark County program, it's kind of interesting. We're kind of in a no man's land in that program. So if prices go down, that payment isn't going to go up like it has. That's capped out, right? It's capped out in terms of this is going to be the biggest it's probably going to be, right? And the other side of that is we're in what we worried about in terms of if prices go up. Our analysis shows that when we get an improvement of market prices, we take some of those government payments away, right? So we're in this situation right now where, in fact, I think the analysis we did the other day shows that for every additional dollar of revenue we get from improved prices, we take away, as I recall, 67 cents of government payments, right? So you only net out about a third of that in terms of a cash revenue increase.
And again, it's going to be very helpful, both programs. It's just that they're not going to stop the red ink.
Right.
That's the point we want to make.
Right.
And crop insurance, you got to remember that's within year. And so unless the price drops dramatically from the projected to the harvest price period, you don't get a payment for a reduction in price. And so we have to remember that. That's why the revenue guarantee is so much lower than it was, as we're using lower prices for our projected harvest price. That's just the way the program works. And then of course, you certainly don't want to not buy insurance. Again, because of downside risk, you want to protect yourself from a casualty liability standpoint in addition to the crop insurance.
Right. So the other part here that we ought to think about is how we kind of manage the more specific financial side of this business. And one of the key things we wanted to do in this webinar was to make sure we didn't focus all of our attention on the financial side of the business. There's a lot of things we can do to manage the operations side to be able to mitigate the downside that we have here. But clearly this whole issue of managing the capital assets is really critical. Some of the analysis we've seen suggests that if you really do feel you want some and need some new equipment, et cetera, you really ought to think seriously about a leasing alternative. Leasing arrangements look pretty attractive. Generally, leasing is a more cash conserving strategy compared to buying a piece of equipment, a combine, power unit, et cetera. Less cash commitment to do it, plus lease programs today are really pretty attractively priced. There's 3-year leases out there where you can lease a piece of equipment for 3 years, and then if you're worried about, well, gee, I don't want to buy something that's a year or two old because I worry about the fact that it won't have the new technology on it, and you can give this leased asset up in 3 years and buy a new one at that point when things have recovered. So there's some real flexibility with that leasing arrangement. If we end up having to, Michael, give up a little land, we haven't got this piece of equipment that we bought that we have to kind of now unload at the same time, and so there's some real advantages to doing some leasing in this environment.
What are the 2 or 3, if I'm thinking about a relatively young piece of used equipment versus a lease, what are the 2 or 3 things in that lease agreement that you pay closest attention to?
Well, I think you do need to make sure that you have looked at what the residual value is that they're putting on that lease, so you kind of know, because that's what's going to drive the size of the lease payments, right? You also need to make sure that compare those lease payments to the P&I payments you're going to have if you're going to borrow the money to do that. Don't get as motivated as we might have been in the past in terms of this issue of, well, I need to buy it to get all these tax benefits, right? Because I don't think we're going to see as much interest, Michael, in terms of needing to buy equipment for tax benefits.
No, not with crop farms. And so the Section 179 is just a different critter this year and next year, quite frankly, than it has been in previous years, because we're just not looking at as much taxable income.
Right.
And that's another reason why people are looking at leasing. It's the flexibility, but it's also the fact that we're not necessarily going to need the Section 179 deduction. Our taxable income's already relatively low compared to what it was.
Yep.
But leasing, I think you want to compare the lease payments to, like Mike said, the principal and interest. But also, you always talk about comparing the down payment.
Yes, right.
What's the down payment for buying the used piece of equipment? How much do you have to have down to start the lease?
Yep.
Compare that. That's certainly very important, because that's going to take out of your working capital that you need for cash rent decisions and other things.
And it's pretty common that lease, the amount of cash you need to put into a lease is generally less cash than you'd have to make in terms of the down payment.
That's not surprising.
That's pretty typical.
But I don't want to ignore the tax consequences. They should be considered, but they certainly are not the driving force. I don't think in this
They're not
decision.
the dominant driver.
No,
like they have
it's how
been
much
in the
cash
past.
am I expending that first year and second and third year and so on.
Right. So the other side of this is to really make sure that you are having some really good conversations with your lender about what your situation is. Everybody's heard it, but it just doesn't. It doesn't hurt to say it again. Lenders don't like surprises. You're just a lot better off to be honest and forthright and say, here's where we are, and when you're having your loan review with your lender, many farmers are going into that season right now. Make sure that you can try to anticipate the kind of questions he or she is going to be asking you, right? And don't say, well, I don't know. I mean, think about it. I suspect, quite frankly, that one of the first questions out of the box is going to be, what's your cost of production going to be this year? And if you say, well, I don't know, that doesn't give them a good sight that you really have thought about things. They're also going to be asking questions about, well, where are you in terms of your working capital position?
Which is a perfect time for a question I did get emailed to me.
Yeah, okay.
How do I know I have enough? Is there a guideline? What is your lender looking for on working capital?
I think your lender this year is going to be doing the calculation like we did earlier on in terms of this working capital per ratio to the revenue stream. He's probably going to be looking for 30% or more this year, and again, because he or she understands that I need a more buffer than normal because this working capital is probably going to get burned up this next year, so I better get a little more cushion in that working capital position than I've had. So it's a pretty simple computation, Michael. What you do is you get your current assets, which is all of those inventories plus your cash plus any kind of supplies you bought, et cetera. You subtract your liabilities from that, your current liabilities, ratio that to whatever your projected gross revenue is, and you want a cushion of about a 30% buffer in there, would be at least my judgment.
Yes.
Michael?
I think at least 30%, because if you have a relatively low one now, the next 2 years are going to be relatively rough. And so that's not going to be a good sign
Right.
in terms of holding on to your rented ground and being
Right.
able to buy machinery that you might need. And so I think 30% is kind of a bare minimum.
Yep.
And a lot of people are coming out of some pretty good years where they might still be sitting at 40, 50%.
That's right.
But even those people have to be relatively cautious given what we're facing here for the next couple of years.
Yep. Yep. So and that's a really important conversation to have on that. And then if you find, and this may be the case, you find that you do that calculation and it's something less than 120 or 20%. Well, you're walking in there with maybe a number that you think your lender's going to be pretty uncomfortable with. So now's the time then to start thinking about how could I kind of solve that working capital problem, or what can I do about that? And back to kind of where we started here with some of this in terms of this whole set of financial metrics. In some cases, we've just tried to pay that debt off too fast. I mean, we borrowed money on land and trying to pay it off in 10 years. Well, when you had, $6, $7 corn, that was okay. When you got today's corn price, we used to, Michael, this is gray hair, we used to borrow money for 30 years when land up until recently was standardly a 20 to 25 year repayment. And so we're going to have to think about how to extend our terms on those land. Will we have to pay more interest? Yes, but at these low interest rates, that's probably not too much of a painful for us. And get that land payment extended out so we got a longer repayment schedule to get that draw on that cash and that working capital pulled down. Same as on machinery. We need to think about linking in those repayment terms. We really, really do need, if we haven't done it, we really got to get those interest rates locked in. We're going to know here in a week or so, but I expect we finally are going to see some of those rates go up on us. Not go up fast, not hard, but there's no reason to not lock in about as cheap as money as we're going to ever see, right?
And in the mid 1980s or early 1980s, we saw machinery on operating loans. Hopefully, we're not seeing that today. But nevertheless, if it's on a 2-3 year loan, let's try to stretch it out a little bit.
Right.
Reduce those payments per year.
Right.
Improve our cash flow situation.
Yep. And we need to be pretty cautious about being seduced to buy that almost new piece of equipment, right? In fact, that's the first thing that I think a lender is going to say to us if we're pushing the edge here in terms of his or her underwriting standards is you just can't make those kind of capital expenditures. I'm sorry, I know you'd like to buy that new piece of equipment. It's really and when things kind of get better, we'll be able to get that done. Let's think about if you really need it. Maybe we think about a lease arrangement, but now this gets really messy. And maybe that condo you bought when things were really good, maybe there's some things we need to think about there in terms of reducing family living. Family living expenses have got to the point where they take a lot of money out of and they drain money from the business, right? I mean, they take money out of the business, reduce the liquidity, and they don't generate any revenue on top of it. I mean, this is kind of the things from a business perspective to the toughest things from a lender's perspective to say, geez, taking money out to do those types of things just isn't working very well. Maybe we need to unload some of those.
And going back to the machinery purchases again, you typically look at depreciation of machinery and say, well, I need a little bit more than that long term to replace the machinery. Well, we're in a situation now where we might want to just use the machinery to pay down other debt.
Yeah. Yep.
And not worry about replacing depreciation plus some money for machinery.
Right.
And you can do that for 2-3 years.
Yep.
I mean.
Yep. So Michael, the things we've talked about here, Mike and Mike, we just haven't really, in a way, identified much new, right? I mean, so they've sat there and they said, okay, what's new here? They're going to come up with some silver bullet? No, there aren't any silver bullets.
There isn't a silver bullet.
There's just no. But you put all these together and you go back and kind of refine what you've done. And it's really, I think, important for producers to understand that they know how to do this because that's the way they had to farm for quite a few years prior to the run-up we had and starting in 2008, 9, and 10. I mean, it was every morning you got up and you said, my job is to lower my costs today, right? I mean, that's my job. So we're really talking about returning to the basics here. We're talking about just dusting off that old playbook and figuring out how to just do what we really do know. We got just a little bit sloppy in these good times. Things maybe tried some new ideas, and if they didn't work well, it's $6 corn. It was try a new idea, a new technology. If it doesn't work, well, we just didn't make quite as much as we would have otherwise. Now we're talking about the other side of that is, well, new ideas have to really have good high payoffs before they're going to be something we ought to seriously be adopting in our business.
So tell me a little bit, if we think the next 2 or 3 years are going to be tough times, tell me about the difference between resiliency and agility and what that means. Because I think what you're talking about in good times is maybe we test some things out, we're pretty agile, but here in the next few years, a little different story.
Well, it's really important to recognize that in the tougher times, there will be opportunities. And so we've been spending a lot of our time talking about this issue of resiliency. How do you maintain the resiliency of your business? How do you make sure that and you have to kind of be, but you just like sports, you got to play offense as well, right? And sometimes it's in the more difficult time when you're going to have the best opportunities. You will have the opportunity to pick up a piece of rented ground that you never thought you could pick up, right? Now, you have to be darn careful you don't bid too much to pick it up. But there's going to be more churn in the rental market. There's going to be, for those that have strong working capital positions, there's going to be the opportunity to buy some new technology at a really significantly discounted price compared to what it was in the past, right? There might even be a good farm sale that you might want to, but be careful. Don't go there and say, I'm willing to pay anything for this, like you might have been willing to do when you had, again, $6 or $7 corn. We've got to really think about having the financial resiliency to get through this downturn, but don't get so much in a hunker down mode that we kind of lose sight of the fact that out of these times will come some opportunities, and let's make sure that we do pursue those opportunities in this environment.
Yeah, and I think, if we just think about what key kind of takeaway here today is that none of us can predict the future, producers can't predict the future, but we can look out and see how the future might unfold and think about some different scenarios and make sure that we're well positioned to do that by managing on the cost side, by thinking about how we market our crops, how we store them. So all these things can help us be more successful in this time of potential opportunities as it unfolds. So I think you've also got some additional tools that you're thinking about to help them make those decisions, and maybe you want to talk just a little bit about that upcoming webinar.
Yeah, let's do that. We have our website listed here, and I want to draw attention to under featured publications. If you look on the website, resources for managing in a financial downturn, there's some really good information on there, including quite a bit of the stuff we've talked about today. Is in different publications under that site, and so take a look at that. But our December 18th webinar is going to focus on cash rent decisions, and again, we're not going to be just looking at 2016. How much a premium do I need to pay in 2016? We're going to be looking at five years out, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, and using kind of a 5-year framework to see how much we can afford to pay and still have some working, fairly safe position in terms of working capital at the end of the 5 years.
And so this webinar is going to be not only talking about the idea, but then actually helping them kind of think about how this actual tool can actually be tailored explicitly to their business.
We have a paper on the website and a spreadsheet on the website, and we're going to be focusing on that paper and that spreadsheet. It's a tool that a producer could put in their scenarios in terms of prices.
Right.
You don't have to use the price scenarios that I'm going to show. You can use some other price scenarios.
Right.
You could also use scenarios related to cash rent.
Right.
You can see what's going to happen if cash rents don't change at all. That's not pretty.
Yeah.
Okay. but you can take a look at that, and but you could also take a look at what happens if cash rents drop 5% per year. That's a strategy I quite often show people.
Right.
Under that, I'm not saying that that's the way it's going to play out, but it's a scenario.
Yep.
Let's see what would happen to working capital under that scenario. And so that's the key, is you can look at 2-3 different scenarios and see where your working capital ends up under those different scenarios.
And so they input their own costs, their own prices,
Yes.
their own yields, their own productivity, et cetera. So
Yes.
it's not just what Purdue says,
No.
it's for their farm.
Yes.
So it's a tool.
That's another reason why you need cost of production, is
Right.
you're going to have you enter the farmer's cost of production. It starts with Purdue's cost and returns, but you certainly should use your own
Right.
rather than ours. It's just
Right.
a starting place.
Right.
And then from that, you add price scenarios, add cash rent scenarios. You add how much you're going to need to take out for operator labor, and it'll do some working capital calculations.
Yep. Very good.
It's really quite simple,
Yeah.
but it's powerful,
Yeah.
very powerful. Because until we did this tool, I don't know about you, Mike, before we did this tool, I wasn't even thinking about this premium correctly.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking way too short term. This is really more of a long-term
That's right.
decision.
Yep. This is what we call options thinking. You
Yes.
know, we're willing to pay an option, but we got to make sure we don't pay too much and destroy the value when we're paying an option. You know, and we've seen that happen in other markets where they pay too much of an option premium. You know, whether it be in the computer stock market or whether it be in terms of commodity markets. You got to worry about how much option premium you're paying. And then you also got to worry about this issue of what kind of ability I have to hold this position in terms of my financial side. That working capital question. Yep.
Well, let's not give away the whole webinar here this afternoon.
That's right.
And we've taken everybody's lunch hour if they're in the central time zone, so we'll probably let them get back at it. But appreciate Mike, your time today, and thanks for listening to the webinar.